Hello and welcome to the Stories of Innovation, a podcast by World Vision International Nepal. And I'm your host, Utsav Karel. In today's episode, we'll be discussing quite an interesting topic of putting Somalia in the global startup map. For this one, we have got guest as Nishant Das, who is the Response Innovation Lead at Somali Response Innovation Lab, and Katrin Calledo from Startup Link. Welcome to the Stories of Innovation, Nishant and Katrin.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Today, we are talking about so many exciting things, especially, how frontier economy Somalia has been put back into the map of the startup world, right? So there are so many amazing innovators, amazing innovations that is taking place in a country which has witnessed 30 years long conflict, and there are so many exciting things that are brewing up in the area. So, Nishant, tell us more around Somalia Response Innovation Lab itself, how it came into existence, and what are you guys doing right now? Because we have been hearing quite a lot around, so many exciting things that is going on, and people are always saying hey, you should talk to Nishant because these guys are doing all these cool things around, helping people with different kind of technologies as well as innovative processes. So, Nishant, tell us the story of Somalia Response Innovation Lab.
Sure. Thanks, Utsav. Yeah. So the Response Innovation Lab at a global level is a collaboration, an innovation collaboration between a few different big players. So you've got World Vision, Save the Children, Oxfam, Civic. Originally, one of the original founding members was an academic partner also. But yeah, so it's a global collaboration, but at the different country levels, it's legally hosted by one of those members. And so in different places, and I think you've talked to a few of my other colleagues, it's hosted by one of those NGOs. In Somalia in particular, we are hosted under World Vision legally, but we strategically fit within a consortium that World Vision is one of the lead agencies for. But that doesn't mean we only work with World Vision or only work with those consortium members. Very simply, our approach, I would say, is we're more of an innovation broker versus an incubator ourselves. And so the lab in Somalia came across, started in 2018, 2019. We had a grant, a research grant from the U.S. government through a department that was then known as OFDA. And that was really looking at trying to take the RILS model and looking at the whole model and trying to implement the whole model. And so the RIL has a few pillars, but the ethos is generally around being an innovation broker. So we have something what we call convening, which is the idea that we need to bring people together. So it's very hard to be innovative if you're working by yourself. And for us, very much focused on the humanitarian space, it's looking at, of course, let's bring together humanitarian actors, whether that's international or local NGOs. Let's bring together UN agencies and clusters. Let's look at government, which is a key component. Let's look at the private sector also. So let's bring them all together at the starting point. And that allows us to do things like research and mapping. It also allows us to build consensus and understanding around really difficult topics that might have different perspectives, especially, from an international or local perspective or from a NGO perspective versus private sector space. So we wanted to make sure that we bring everyone together to have a shared understanding, because if you don't have that, then whatever you work on is not necessarily really sustainable. So that's our convening pillar. The next is our matchmaker pillar, which is how we identify and define challenges, but then work to find existing solutions. So again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to help be kind of a cross-learning platform and try and promote especially local solutions if they are there. And so that's how do we, and we want to make sure that there's a process to really understand the challenge, right? There are things that may be well beyond our scope, like insecurity. But there are things that could be quite specific, and we want to make sure that, especially as people get so focused on their work, they may not know what's happening around them. So that's kind of where our role is, to bring those together. And then last is what we call support. And so that's where the RIL has the opportunity to support pilot projects, gather evidence around that, to broker partnerships to make sure it's sustainable in the long run. So that's kind of our approach and model. And throughout that, we're doing research and generating evidence and sharing that. So in 2018, we had a project that was together with George Washington University and the Somali Disaster Resilience Institute, which is now called Sadar Institute. And in that, we had a big component to really, what wanted to do to get started was really understand what was happening in the Somali ecosystem. And so we began with a lot of research. So there was a component of desk-based research. The UN has what they call their 3W map, who, what, where type of thing. And so we took that map, we expanded upon that, and we brought in the innovation actors there, so the private sector, startups, and beyond. And we brought these two maps together, and we really expanded upon that, did a lot of kind of field-based research also to really understand what was going on there. And it was the first time that we had kind of this type of mapping had been done in the Somali context. And through that process, we shared that. We developed a bunch of tools. We wanted to make sure that there were tools available kind of in the public domain. So it wouldn't necessarily require myself or my team to sit down and have a coffee with everyone every time and say, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. We wanted to empower people and say, here is a tool that you can navigate yourself. It can help you as a startup find partners or funding opportunities, as an NGO to find local partners or things in the private sector space, or how do you navigate, key government departments. And so we created a bunch of tools. The first was what we called a directory. So very simple to use, kind of anyone can use it, kind of, fitted for your phone. It's still out there and we keep refreshing and updating it. The second was kind of taking that same data, but looking at kind of the relationships there. So much more in depth, much better for an academic purpose. Most often,
Right.
your lay person doesn't necessarily want to go through like a more detailed Kumu program to look at all of the linkages, but very insightful to know, who is connected to what products and services, where is their funding coming from. And then we produced a report. And so that report came out at the end of 2019. And as we shared it back to a lot of our key stakeholders in the Somali context, what we realized was for the first time, we had data around what was going on, and people found that quite insightful. But a lot of times people intuitively who worked in Somalia or who were part of the larger Somali diaspora, they kind of intuitively knew, oh, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here. Oftentimes the narrative in Somalia is quite negative. If you were to just think of Somalia, it's conflict, it's famine. And there is truth to that. There is a lot of challenges. No one is trying to deny that there is challenges here. But it's only one side of the narrative, right? And what we wanted to show, despite the challenges, there's also significant things that are happening that are really exciting. And so how do we have a more holistic understanding of that? And so what we realized is our data and our mapping tools were showcasing kind of, were there for, preaching to the choir per se, right? People already knew this, but they were happy they had now evidence here. And so that's where we actually came across Startup Blink. And what we were quite excited about Startup Blink is they had a global platform. And they were looking at kind of startup ecosystems specifically around the world. And we had a subset of startup data. And so we found it quite exciting to see, can we actually get the information that we have on a global platform and help to provide a more holistic understanding of the narrative in the Somali context? And so that's kind of how we started. So that's how the lab started in the Somali context. It started really with a mapping exercise, creating these tools, trying to support the wider ecosystem, not just in the Somali context, but also trying to help in bring in outside attention, whether that would be for potential investment and funding, whether it would be for potential partnerships. So that's kind of how we started. And then, of course, we've grown and we've been supporting a bunch of pilots, interesting partnerships, but I can talk about that a bit later.
Perfect. Thanks, Nishant. And since you just mentioned about how Startup Blink came into the picture, Katrin, tell us more around the story behind the Startup Blink itself, because Nishant just shared the story around Somali Response Innovation Lab. And we are more keen to hear about what is Startup Blink, what it does, and, like some of the experience from Somalia itself would be really interesting.
Yeah, great. So Startup Link, so we're a global map and research center, and we usually work with, government agencies or NGOs like Response Innovation Lab in helping them develop their startup ecosystem. So developing the startup ecosystem, it's different per scenario and per location. Some location would need promotion, some location would need more diagnosis and consulting help. And some locations would need more help and just building the capacity of their ecosystem developers. So we cater to each of them. We also do mapping, like Nishant just mentioned. So all of that together, it depends on the need of the ecosystem. We come in and we help through like our global platforms and through our global view. Um, Startup Link, just a brief like history. So we really started in 2017. That's when the
Mm-hmm.
idea came about and the company came about, but it wasn't still focused on ecosystem. So we were really focused on startups, but we realized that there was a lack in the space wherein people were focusing more on. So how do we help those startups instead of just pushing them forward? So the startups also need help where they are, and I think that's what was missing in that period. So our CEO started shifting into redeveloping ecosystems. And then in 2019, we actually released our first report. So every year we release a report about ranking 100 countries and 1,000 cities globally. So through that report, it's more of a free resource for ecosystem developers and also entrepreneurs themselves to know where to relocate and what's the new and up and coming hubs. It's always location is always important because it will help you get to know people, get to know the network, and it will help you innovate more when there's already activity happening. And it also depends on what part of your innovation story you are in. So maybe you're just starting. So maybe an ecosystem, developing ecosystem like Somalia would be good for you. Maybe you want to grow, then you would need to go to a bigger hub, like San Francisco or somewhere in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we were looking at, and specifically in Somalia, I think there we like Nishan mentioned a while ago about how when people think about Somalia, it's always negative or something that's they don't really think about innovation first. And I think what we achieved with our partnership and making sure that Somalia is always put into the spotlight in our rankings is that people are actually happily surprised when they find out that there's so much innovation in Somalia and they're always in the rankings since 2020. Because, for us, promotion and perception is everything. And a lot of ecosystems, they start with just a perception. Maybe it's not the reality first, but perception follows reality. So when people think about you more, they know more about your innovation, the more they're interested to actually move. And also your local ecosystem developers and local startups, they're more interested to stay. So when there's the good startups are staying and other good startups are joining the ecosystem, then that's when we're sort of putting the perception of a good ecosystem into reality. And that's what we're helping with a lot of developing ecosystems to do, put them in a global scale and put them, promoting them globally as well.
Great. Katrin, like since you mentioned that since 2017, you guys have been starting to map and rank, like ecosystems and countries as well. So how is it like to, like rank 100 countries? It must be really, really massive task, right? Like you need to have like a lot of indicators and so many things. So tell us like, a typical country, like what does it needs to have to be in like the top quantile of ranking?
Yeah, definitely, it's a big task, racking that many locations. And
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to go down. Like we're actually planning. Maybe we can rack more, because in a lot of rankings they're only ranking maybe 50 countries and like 200 cities. But
Mm-hmm.
there's really a lot of seed ecosystem that also need to be taken care of and need to be racked and watched. Yeah, so we have like in just a bit of our methodology. So we have around 45 components during the last report. So each report we
Mm-hmm.
also improve what we do. Now we learn from the previous reports about what we can add, and we try to add more until we get to the final algorithm. Hopefully, it won't change anymore. But those 45 components are put into three main baskets: quantity, quality, and business score. When you look at it from like how many, like what should an ecosystem have for it to be ranked. It's really in like, first of all, you need to have startups. Of course, it's a startup ecosystem, so you need to have startups. And for us, in our platform, we have our own definition of startup. Like each platform has theirs. So for example, it has to have like an innovative part of it. We can review the innovation based on location as well. But um, for example, some startups in Somalia at the beginning would not have been considered innovative. But once we got to know more about the ecosystem and other developing ecosystems, and we found out how hard it is actually to build even simple, like what we would think are simpler startups, then we considered them, because just having that innovation in a setting that's really hard to build, like hard to build startups, was already innovative. And aside from innovative aspect, we also look into the technology that was used, and also if there is a website. So since they were a global platform and we have global visitors, it's really important. Like the websites, it's important because people also check. So when they go, for example, to a location, they actually go through the startup list and they usually check the website. So if there's no website, then they can cross check. So it's important to keep the rankings validity and the validity of the map, to have like the map, and to have the website as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Katrin. I've got so many questions for you, but I'll come back to you in a bit. Back to Nishant now. Nishant, since you were talking about one of the pillar of Somalia Response Innovation Lab as a convener, right? And there is where a lot of collaboration with different actors are required. Tell us, how does, what is the experience around collaborating with different actors? Because we all have got a different perception around innovation, right?
Right.
Different actors has got a different definition, different priorities, different resources. So
Right.
tell us your experience about collaborating with different actors.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we've been keen on doing is to not duplicate kind of systems as much as possible. We very much focus on humanitarian settings. There's a lot of innovation, as Katrin kind of alluded to. Innovation can be very different in a San Francisco versus Mogadishu. And so for us, our focus as the Response Innovation Lab is really looking at kind of these frontier economies, fragile contexts, high risk humanitarian settings. And so for us, we wanted to make sure that, with a lot going on, in humanitarian settings, there's, as some of our listeners might be familiar, there's the cluster system. And so for us, it doesn't make sense to have another innovation cluster. It's a cross-cutting issue. And so we don't want to make sure, we want to make sure that we work with existing structures. So for us, things in the Somali context that we've worked with, we work specifically with clusters. So we've worked with the WASH cluster to bring together their members, but then also bring together private sector, for example, academic institutions, government, to make sure that if we're looking at things within the WASH space, that everyone has an understanding, not just the NGOs and donors. And so that's one example of people that we've worked with. It just provided great insights and allowed us to build consensus at a larger level. We worked with the food security cluster, and these were two clusters in particular that we targeted when we first entered into this context, because we knew those were priority areas. There was a lot going on there. But then we've also worked with other initiatives too. So we've worked with iRise, which is a Mogadishu-based innovation hub that organizes the Mogadishu Tech Summit. And we saw that as a great opportunity, as a locally led kind of event that was looking at promoting the innovation ecosystem, looking at startups, but then also as a neat kind of bridge with the humanitarian and donor community. And so we saw that that was kind of a great platform to be able to support them in that work. There is other initiatives too, like the Somali STEM Society that's looking at STEM education, and the importance of younger generation of having a strong gender lens there too. And building STEM capacity is something that is, in the longer term, which will have a, significant impact on the ecosystem. So those are kind of examples, or Simad University, which is one of our partners, they have an innovation hub, and they host something called the Global Goals Jam, which is a global event using kind of human-centered design thinking approaches through the UN, and to address kind of challenges around the sustainable development goals. And so that lab was looking at how do we bring this global event to the Somali context. And so we had the privilege of working together with them to kind of bring that event into the Somali context. They led and we supported them in some of that stuff, and seeing now we're going into the third year into this event, and seeing now kind of having local kind of facilitation and sprint master abilities to facilitate that process. And so we can kind of take a step back now, but look at, within a local context, how do you, look at challenges, but using kind of proven, trusted methodologies to try and really build consensus, dig deep and understand the challenges from a local lens. So it's not just an outside kind of perspective coming in, being kind of parachuted in. So that's kind of, a lot of what we've done. Again, I think part of what we found is key is to kind of curate these events. We don't want to have just NGOs coming together and navel gazing and then having kind of a shorter term perspective. So for us, whenever we do events, either on our own or if we work with someone else, for us, it's the key is you need to have the right people in the room. Because I think that only builds consensus, gives you a much deeper understanding. So that's really a key component. Oftentimes we can be focused on the output, but for us, what we've learned is the process is just as important. And so how do you build that empathy and understanding in the process so that, people don't just complain about, international actors, or they don't just complain about government or complain about donors or local actors, right? They really understand, and they have the chance to understand why are these actors responding in a certain way in a certain context, because these are their limitations or these are their priorities. And we found that facilitating and building that understanding is so key to having a much more healthier ecosystem and healthier partnerships, especially if you want to look at having something that's successful take root and scale. A lot of times, I think a lot of the things that we've seen that has had the opportunity to scale, the technology itself, if it's a tech-based solution, isn't complex. The complex part is building the right partnerships. I think that's a really key thing, right? The technology can be innovative, but really it's not necessarily super disruptive in terms of the tech itself. But what is disruptive and what can have the impact is building those right partnerships so that idea or that innovation has the opportunity to actually take hold, to scale, to learn, to iterate, to improve, and have that positive impact. So again, that's why it's key. The convening component is so key in that, to have that. Going back to the startup side of things, I think what's unique about the Somali context is there's quite a few of these innovation hubs that are local, that provide co-working spaces, that provide kind of mentorship facilitation opportunities. I think that's what makes the Somali ecosystem quite unique, is that there are quite a few in numerous cities, from Mogadishu to Hargeisa to Garowe and beyond, that have these spaces that allow for that kind of collaboration and kind of shared learning, kind of builds that camaraderie. And for us, our key is, with those local initiatives that are happening, how do we now bring in an international perspective to help support that, instead of an international lab coming in and duplicating that? How do we support these local initiatives?
Right. So since we're talking about collaboration, and one of the major thing what most of the international agencies are also inclining towards is public-private partnership. Right. And can you share us some example of such kind of partnership and that led to the sustainability of the innovation process?
Sure, yeah. So there's one of the initiatives that we supported. One of the first that we came across when we started was, I mentioned our matchmaker platform. And so World Vision, which is one of the large NGOs in Somalia, came to us with a challenge in 2018 around, how do you understand the dynamics of school dropouts? Why are children dropping out of school? How do we get better insights on this to improve our programs to better serve these communities, to better serve these schools? And so they submitted, we worked with them, they formally submitted a challenge in our matchmaker platform. And that was actually our very first matchmaker submission. So we began the process to try and research what are some potential solutions that exist already. Now, unfortunately, at the time in the Somali context, there was no system other than paper-based systems for attendance tracking. For better data, you could look at a food security tracking system, a beneficiary tracking system, and heavily update it. So it wasn't really the greatest fit. So we looked and we found a few different solutions in the region and globally. One was in the U.S., had a lot of maturity and a lot of scale, but a very, very different context. We found another one that was being piloted in East Africa, but very early stages, but had some really key, interesting components around making sure you track the attendance of the teachers, because there's a lot of challenges when teachers don't show up. And so
Right.
then, of course, then the students don't learn, right? So it had some really interesting components, but very small scale, not very mature. And then we found this system that was actually developed by the University of Nairobi's C4D lab, which is kind of their innovation kind of space, and UNICEF in Kenya. And what was really neat about this system is that they had spent the time to build the system over time from the ground up. They had done a lot of work to consult teachers, and they'd even piloted this system in Somali-speaking regions of Kenya. And so it showed a lot of promise. And so we identified these few solutions. We went back to World Vision and said, here are some different solutions, right? What do you think? We have a methodology where we can show, what is fit for context and different things. But in discussion with World Vision, what they realized was, one is the UNICEF-backed system seemed to show the best promise for the Somali context. One is the system was open source, and two, there's a strong connection, back and forth between Kenya and Somalia, especially with UN agencies. UN leads the education cluster, and the system had been piloted in Somali-speaking regions already, so it showed a lot of promise. So what we did then was we then went to UNICEF, and they then said, this is great if you want to bring it into the Somali context. We'll get the regional approval. It's open source, but you have our blessing in that sense. And then what we did was we worked specifically with that Kenyan startup, and we brought them out to the Puntland state in Somalia, and they did an assessment. They talked to teachers, they talked to education officers at various NGOs, they talked to the local government. They really wanted to understand. We didn't want to assume that this system would work because it was coming from a different context.
Right.
And all of those discussions were really insightful, and there were things that provided feedback. And we said, okay, if we are going to bring this, we need to update these components, right? The school year is on a different calendar. The way attendance is done is slightly different, right? It's not necessarily alphabetical because of the context. They do boys first, then girls, So there were things that we learned through this assessment that we had to update, which wouldn't have been there if we didn't get the insights from the local education ministry and teachers and so forth. We worked very quickly to do a very kind of low budget kind of update of the system. And then we partnered with World Vision to pilot the system at 3 schools. So we wanted to do a very small scale pilot, low risk, but to see, can this system work in the right context? That was in 2019. And we ran a pilot for about 6 months. And at the end, we did an evaluation. So the Response Innovation Lab, we have our own kind of M&E tools that are designed specifically for introducing new innovations. And so we did this evaluation. Overall, it showed that the pilot was a success, and there were things that were learned there. And we were then looking to scale it further. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So everything kind of went on pause. As everyone's priorities shifted and schools were shut down for a period of time. But what was interesting during that time, we also saw that the system, because it was a digital system, we learned that teachers were able to stay connected with some of their students and follow up on them. And so that was a really neat, unexpected outcome to show this other dynamic that came from that. And then as, later in 2020, as kind of the pandemic, there was a new normal and schools were trying to reopen. Another NGO called Save the Children came across our system, and they were working with the ministry to build a dashboard to analyze and understand the data at a macro level, but they were still using paper-based inputs. And so we then, began the process of discussions to say, okay, there are 2 different systems here. Is there a value add to bring these components together? And so then we helped facilitate a process to form a partnership between Save the Children, which was leading an education consortium with SIDRA and CARE, and World Vision to now look at integrating these two systems. So not only did you have this dashboard for the government, but you also had a real-time kind of input for the data. That was a long process in terms of the negotiation to build those partnerships, but it was important. And then we made the two systems interoperable. And so that was co-funded by both parties. The government was involved also in terms of looking at indicators. So again, this is a long process. Again, from a tech perspective, to integrate two systems is not complex. What was complex was making sure that the different NGOs and governments were all on board and were willing to do this together. And that was a process to get approvals and MOUs and all of that stuff. But, we did it slowly, but we did it well. That then resulted in a pilot, and we scaled again from the original 3 schools to 42 schools now across the Puntland region, which is quite exciting. And, I mentioned the Mogadishu Tech Summit. We back in December, of 2022, or 2021, we actually brought together these different actors from the government, from World Vision, from Save the Children, from the tech startup, CC Tech, to talk about the importance of working together between the private sector, government, civil society. How do you all work together over time to have a more holistic solution? And so that was quite neat and interesting. And right now, the Somali context, there hasn't been rain in a while, and we're looking at the situation is quite bad. It's moving into a famine situation. UNICEF, which was the original backer of the system, is now looking at how do you introduce this system as part of their drought relief programs, right? As they're looking at having interventions that can, keep children in school so that they're not disrupted. You need to track how successful your programs are. So UNICEF is now looking at bringing on this system and scaling it up even further to more schools to have an impact. So again, going back to 2018, where the original challenge was submitted, to now 2022, 4 years later, that time. But, what we've learned is, again, the transparency. When one agency does something, we do an evaluation, we share it in the public domain. We want people to learn from it, what was successful, even what was not successful. And that has helped with building those partnerships to get it to where it is now.
I think that's brilliant. You talked about how we develop a relationship between different agencies, how we remain open as well as we make our system interoperable is something that really helps in terms of, getting it in a long run, and also, using it in multiple purpose as well. Now, Katrin, I've got a question for you, and that is more related to how startup ecosystems are evolving right now, especially in frontier economies like Somalia or Nepal or Iraq.
Yeah, so I think in the past few years we've been seeing a rise of startups and the startup ecosystems in general in Africa and Asia as a whole. Actually, in the past few rankings, we've been seeing, the rankings of general rankings in Europe and even in North America going down just because, this developing ecosystems have been growing a lot. And it's in part because of, globalization. So people now understand more of digitalization. And, actually, like a good part that we observed during the pandemic was that since people were forced to go back like indoors, being locked down, they had to look for a lot of ways to be innovative and to create their own business and innovate. And even as Nishant was saying, like even schools had to be innovative. So this actually brought in a new breed of innovation. Like people were now not afraid as much with digitalization. A lot of frontier ecosystems were already afraid of doing fintech or doing business online because you don't see the person that you're working with. But since we were forced into that situation during COVID, we saw a lot of rise in that, and people like a lot of ecosystems as well in frontier ecosystems who were more, dependent on a specific just one industry. They had to be diverse, so they had to innovate a lot during that time. So, actually, like in startup life, we really observe that there's a lot of innovation that's happening during crisis time because people have to think on their feet. They have to be quick, and there's not a lot of bureaucracy during this time because you need to be fast in order to get over the crisis.
Right. So innovation normally comes up during the time of crisis, right? And I still remember, like before the pandemic, we used to, do few virtual calls, right? Like the WebEx thing, and there was like I don't remember like I heard about Zoom before the pandemic, and all of a sudden everyone are in Zoom, and even we are doing this podcast on Zoom as well, right? And 5 years ago, if somebody had asked me about, like, can you do podcast over Zoom? Then I would be like, no, we need to meet in person and we have to do things, right? But now things have changed. And I think, when we are reflecting some of the, like uptake of technology, then the pandemic has played a really, really important role in terms of fintech adoption or online shopping, as well as, like using different kind of mobile application as well. So this is promising, especially to us who are working in the space of innovation, to see how technology has been evolving and people are accepting and appreciating the whole use of technology, which is, I think, great. But at the same time, there's also a digital divide, right? Because especially in country like Nepal or in frontier economies, already the poverty is there. Now we are seeing digital divide as well. So have you come across any, like cool innovation that has been trying to address this kind of digital divide and try to help people, especially in the frontier economies?
Yeah, maybe I can start. So
Yes,
I think
please.
even in a lot of frontier ecosystems and economies, we do see that there's still a bit of digitalization. So I think not focusing as much on the innovation, but really focusing on getting people more interested in digitalization is important. So like coming up with apps or going on like social media, because I've observed personally that in a lot of frontier ecosystems, like social media is abundant. Even if
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of poverty, there's still a lot of social media, and like the social media part is still there. So trying to combine innovation into what they already have, and the systems that they already have, like having it like on their phones or on like basic social media platforms that we have, and not having too many barriers, is important to get people who might not have the capacity to be in the digital space yet, to be introduced at least, and then work our way from there. And that also comes for the innovators. We need to include innovators who might not have the capacity yet to build innovation in a grand, in the disruptive, as Nisha a while ago mentioned, like a
Mm-hmm.
disruptive innovation. But, acknowledge even the small wins that they have, because for them, like for us, might be small win, but for them, it's really a big step towards innovation and innovating.
Thanks, Katrin. So, Nishant, since you have been working in the space of innovation for quite a while, and you have been doing quite a lot in this area to, like not just bring innovation in a country like Somalia, but also to sustain these innovation through multiple partnership. Like, if you have to pick one promising innovation and one promising innovator out of like so many you have been working with, who would that be, and why do you think that particular innovation is promising out of all? I'm sorry to put you in a very difficult spot right now, but out of curiosity, because there are certain elements, right, like that really makes certain innovation more promising, and also that can be learning for other context as well.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a tough spot there. There's so much happening. And so yeah, I would encourage anyone listening to check out the Startup Blink ranking, because there's so much there and I won't have time to profile all of them. But yeah, I'm sure in the show notes we can put some links there that people can check out later. But one that I've had the privilege of working with over the last few years is a startup called Ogo Health. Ogo Health is a startup that's looking at digitizing health records. And again, I'm going to be very biased and look at a humanitarian, perspective, right? There's a lot happening even beyond that. But, one that I'm quite excited about is from the humanitarian perspective. So Ogo Health, the founder, Khalid Hashi, is he noticed from a personal experience when, he was visiting his grandmother and she got ill and then had to go to the hospital, and just seeing that process and how inefficient it was, especially with regards to records, got him on this process to develop a system. And what was neat was not only was the system he developed kind of crowdfunded and developed his own kind of initial system, then went and applied for the Global Open IDEO Challenge, was successful, and got some kind of seed funding and mentorship from IDEO and seed funding from the Gates Foundation, kind of really took a human-centered approach to really rebuild a system. And that's where it began to pivot to look at how do you provide, and it took a focus on looking at the challenge around vaccinations, especially for children under 5. And you're looking at a context where one is, you have a population that is nomadic, but then also you have a population that due to different kind of shocks could be displaced. And so they're moving around. And so, especially with children under 5, you need to complete vaccination cycles. And how do you track that when people are moving across areas and they're going to different clinics, but they may not remember that they have to go to a clinic, and, you don't have a national ID system, so it's difficult with all of these different types of records. So they developed this system that links different clinics together. And then it also, we talked about the digital divide. It also sends SMS updates as reminders to families in remote areas to come back for follow-up appointments. And so that has been quite successful. Very quickly, what they realized also was that, no matter where you are in the world, unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstanding or lack of knowledge when it comes to medical procedures and vaccinations. And so they started to develop a public health library as part of the system to educate people. Why is it important to get these different services? So that was quite promising. And then we had the promise. So that system is again, the challenge again came through our matchmaker system, where an NGO identified a challenge around this. And this is and when we looked for the solution, again, we found global solutions that were out there, nothing that at the time that had been in the Somali context. But then through our mapping, ecosystem mapping, we had come across Ogo, and being a local solution, and from other experience, we've seen it's much easier to push forward a locally driven solution in terms of understanding context and scalability in the long term, and sustainability. So again, this is why it's so important why ecosystem mapping exercise is so important, because it helps to understand what is happening right at a local level, and there are things that are happening at a local level. So Ogo Health is one that's keen, and we had the privilege of working together with them during the COVID response, right before everything shut down in March of 2020. I reached out to Khalid in February to said, I think you should consider. I think COVID's going to be a big deal, right? COVID, January, February 2020, right? There was still not a whole lot known really in terms of what would actually ensue. And so we then looked at seeing how do we add to this library around COVID messaging in Somali language. And so he funded it himself. And the week that we had the first COVID case in March 2020, he had his first video there, the only Somali language content out there. And he tapped into some of his networks we use WHO guidelines, but then he tapped into some of his international networks through Johns Hopkins University, with the public health advisor. And so this then started a whole process. So this is the first Somali language public health awareness tools that were in the region. That then evolved with them to develop more content, and very quickly, I helped to facilitate a process and say, every NGO doesn't need to have their own hand washing videos, right? Why don't we work together? Right. Again, this is the importance of working as an ecosystem collaboratively. Limited resources, especially a lot of uncertainty, borders shut down, right, in this pandemic. So we then very quickly started to bring together UN agencies, governments, NGOs, private sector, to identify locally driven priorities, then worked with, WHO guidance at the time, and then worked through other connections we had, again, at Johns Hopkins to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, brought in experts, within World Vision that host us at their global level, their health experts, to now holistically come up with something that we knew was medically accurate, but then locally appropriate. Again, that interdependency and collaboration. And, OGO was one of our key partners in that. And, very quickly moved from basic hand washing videos to stuff like how do you do Sharia, how do you do Islamic burials in a time of during a pandemic, and very complex stuff. And so, very excited with this startup. And there are many others too. But yeah, let me stop at that for now.
Perfect. Thanks, Nishant. So I have a question for both of you. So this is around what do you think are the enablers of innovation? Like if you have to name 1, 2, 3, then, what are the enablers of innovation for you based on your experience? Who wants to go first?
Katrin, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Out of the top of my head, I think the first one would definitely be the need. So, if you need something, you have to look for a way to achieve that need. So, a lot of innovation comes from, problem solving, how to solve maybe a simple or complex problem, and that really, that evolves the innovation into a thought and then into a product. So, I think the need is definitely an enabler. Second, as it's a lot about location. I think the location is also, enables you into trying to innovate, because if you're in a location where there's not much happening, you might not be inspired, or you might not meet the right people to help you think out of the box. So location is everything. So I think, for example, in Somalia, there's a lot of, spaces where people can meet and talk and innovate together. So that's really important, because community is really important in innovation. You need people to talk to, people to get ideas from and collaborate. And I think the third one is help from either government or international organizations. So in a lot of especially in developing ecosystems or frontier ecosystems, we need that help in order to enable people to want to innovate, because a lot of the frontier ecosystems, their main need is to survive or to get money. So a lot of them just shift towards traditional jobs, like working in a big company or brick and mortar jobs. So if they don't have a choice, then they won't want to think out of the box and innovate. Yeah, so those are the 3 things for me.
Okay, so it's need, location, and support from government and international agencies.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katrin. And Nishant?
I think, Katrin, you've hit that on the head, and I can see those very clearly in the Somali context too. Before I took up the role, one of the things that was told to me coming into the Somali context was there's so much innovation happening because of necessity, right? You've had, as Utsav opened up with, 30 years where, the civil war and the federal government collapsed. And out of that, then people have to do things for themselves, right? So there was a lot of startups and stuff out of necessity, right? Necessity breeds innovation. We saw that during the pandemic also. And so that's definitely one of the things that has been key it's kind of this double-edged sword, right? There is a lot of need, and it's a sad thing. The needs are there, but it empowers people, and it forces people to then try and find those solutions. So definitely is something that I can have seen quite actively in the Somali context. The other, like you said, spaces, Somalia has been quite fortunate to have a lot of these kind of innovation spaces and co-creation spaces. That's been key. And then, I think another one that I've seen too is kind of this, along with the communities, this interdependency. I think oftentimes to support innovation at the early stage, right? Funding is definitely important. Everyone, who's going to say no to money? Everyone needs resources, but it's not necessarily financial resources that are there, right? I think it's these other resources that are so important. So that can be found at a local level, And then that's one of the things as the Response Innovation Lab we try to support with is bringing in other resources too, whether it is international connections or connections with the humanitarian space. If people have ideas, how do you roll out those ideas? We have a lot of tools that are all freely available in the public domain to help with making those connections, to help gather evidence and so forth around that. So I think definitely resources, financial and beyond, are definitely another thing that helps if you have those in that space. And that's really unique, and I think in frontier economies is how do you bridge that divide between, let's say, investments in private sector and civil society and donors, right? Can it grant de-risk a loan, right? Whereas now, a traditional financier, a bank, or an investor who may have never considered this is now more incentivized to enter in, and we begin to see some of that stuff in the Somali context that's beginning to show promise, and it's building the relationship with things, startups and others that would have never had that because they were too high risk from a traditional sense. So I think bringing in those resources and connections is vital, especially in a frontier economy, which you don't want to be only dependent on a grant, right? How do you build that longer term sustainability?
Okay, so since we are almost there in terms of timing, right? So I've got this final curiosity to put forward rather than a question. So how do you see the future of the Somali ecosystem, let's say 5 years down the line? I know there are like a lot of groundworks being laid, and then so many fantastic things that has been done in the last 4 or 5 years, but next 5 years, considering so many emerging technologies, new kind of partnership, as well as new challenges as well, like you briefly mentioned about famine, as well as different kind of other natural calamities, as well as global warming and so many things happening right now. So how do you see the future of Somali ecosystem 5 years down the line?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time. I think when it comes to the innovation space, I think technology is a huge enabler, and I think especially with a lot of our work together with Startup Link, it's helped to put a spotlight about the opportunities there. And so we're already beginning to see, whether it's in the larger diaspora community, a lot of diaspora have come back to the Somali context out of seeing a need to, bring back some of their skills and resources to support things at a local level. So that's quite exciting. So I'm optimistic to see that trend continue, to bring back some of those global resources there beyond just remittances, to actually come back and work together in partnership. And I think also now with some of the information that we've now put in the public domain, to bring in others who are not necessarily Somali diaspora or people who had a strong connection before, who are now interested in coming into the Somali context to do work because they see opportunities there, not just necessarily needs, that is a big driver, but also seeing opportunities. We're seeing, as one of the things that we've been able to showcase and highlight, here are businesses and startups that are doing work and are making money, right? So people, as another incentive, there is an opportunity to come and do things here. There's not just, and here are challenges, but here are also examples through our mapping that you can see people overcoming those challenges and making a livelihood, making a profit. So I think that's one that I'm excited to see in the next few years, is seeing more of this kind of interdependency and partnership and more of a resource flow. There's a lot, as Katrin had mentioned, that, there's a lot of innovation that is happening in the Somali context. And that's not necessarily super disruptive if you were to put it in a context like, let's say, San Francisco, but because they can make it in such a challenging environment, that is quite innovative. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from Somalia for other countries too. I think with our COVID response, how Somalia very quickly started to respond to create locally driven content and awareness material. That was something in the early days that we were asked to help bring out a global platform. So other countries could learn, how did Somalia and actors in the Somali context pivot and work so quickly. I think there's a lot to learn there too. So yes, I think, bringing a lot of those partnerships and resources and people in, I think is something, and technology being an enabler, so people can come in physically, but also do things remotely, is one key thing that I continue to be optimistic to see in the next 5 years.
Great, Nishant. So Katrin, what do you think? next 5 years down the line?
Yeah, same as Nishan, we're very optimistic about, the
Hmm.
development of the Somali startup ecosystem. We see a lot of good things happening, especially since they have a lot of support from, local enablers and also um, international neighbors like Response Innovation Lab. So, like working together with the local ecosystem is important for them to grow. And we see a lot of innovation coming out of Somalia, and we hope that even with the challenges, like what you mentioned a while ago, necessity does breed innovation. So I think that there will be a lot of innovation, hopefully, that will come it from, energy and environment sector, like trying to fight against like what's happening with global warming. We're actually already seeing that. Like, if you go to the Somalia portal right now, you will see that the second highest industry there is the energy environment. So people are already innovating in that space, and I think we will see more of innovation in that space in the next few years.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you. And I'm sure like these innovation, which will really help to, solve some of the pressing issues of the community, of the people, and also to make the community better place for the future. So thanks so much, guys, for your time. Really appreciate, hearing about all the amazing experience and insights. And I'm also really hopeful about, all the amazing things that is coming, that is going to happen in the near future as well. And congratulations for all the great works you guys have been doing. And thank you again.
Thank you for having us. It's a
Yeah,
great to talk to you and talk about the Somali ecosystem as well.
yeah, great.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Utsab and team. Yeah, very excited that we had this space to profile it. I hope it was insightful for other ecosystems that are emerging too. And yeah, thank you, Startup Link and Katrin in particular, for joining us and helping to share some of those global insights. Thanks.
Thanks, Nishant. Thanks, Katrin.